King's guard charges his horse at two piss-taking tourists. People from different countries stood quietly, holding cameras, whispering to each other, and waiting for the guards to appear. For many tourists, this place was not just a sightseeing spot, but a symbol of history, tradition, and pride. They had read about it in books, seen it in videos, and now they were finally standing there in real life. The guards arrived right on time, just as they always did. Their uniforms were neat, their posture straight, and their expression serious. One guard, mounted on a tall, well-trained horse, moved into position near the boundary line. He had done this duty many times before. For him, this was not a performance or a show. It was a responsibility passed down through years of strict training and discipline. His job was to protect the area, maintain order, and represent the dignity of the institution he served. The horse stood calmly beneath him, used to crowds, noise, and flashing cameras. Its slow breathing and steady movements showed years of training. The guard gently held the reins, his eyes scanning the area. He was aware of every movement around him, even though his face showed no emotion. Tourists often misunderstood this stillness. They thought the guards were lifeless or unbothered, but in truth, they were alert at every second. Among the crowd were two tourists who stood out, not because of how they looked, but because of how they behaved. They were young, full of energy, and clearly more interested in joking than learning. At first, they simply laughed loudly and made comments to each other. Some nearby visitors glanced at them with mild annoyance, but no one said anything. The guards, as trained, ignored them. As minutes passed, the two tourists began to act more boldly. They stepped closer to the boundary line, pretending to copy the guards' posture and laughing when their imitation failed. One of them pointed at the horse, making playful sounds, while the other tried to take exaggerated photos. To them, it all felt harmless. They believed they were just having fun and creating memories. They did not stop to think about where they were or what the rules meant. The rest of the crowd felt uncomfortable. Parents gently pulled their children back. Some visitors lowered their cameras, sensing that the situation was becoming awkward. The atmosphere slowly changed. What had started as a peaceful morning began to feel tense, like a quiet string pulled too tight. The guard noticed everything. Though his face remained still, his mind was active. He had seen such behavior before. Tourists often tested limits, assuming nothing would happen. He knew his duty well. The boundary line was clear. Crossing it was not allowed, and disrespectful behavior could not be ignored forever. Still, he waited. Training taught patience before action. The horse shifted slightly, sensing the change in energy. Animals trained for such duties were highly aware of their surroundings. The guard adjusted his grip, not aggressively, but with readiness. His focus stayed forward, but his awareness included the two tourists moving closer than they should. One of the tourists stepped just past the boundary, laughing as he did so. He turned to his friend, clearly expecting a reaction. The friend followed, encouraged by the lack of immediate response. To them, silence meant permission. They had mistaken discipline for weakness. A few people in the crowd quietly shook their heads. Some whispered warnings, but the tourists ignored them. Cameras were still raised, but now not just for photos. People sensed something important was about to happen. The guard took a slow breath. His training told him that moments like this defined the role he played. This was not about anger or pride. It was about responsibility. The rules existed to keep order and safety, not to spoil anyone's fun. The guard prepared himself to act if needed, hoping the tourists would step back on their own. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The morning air felt heavier. The tourists laughed again, unaware of how close they were to crossing a line that could not be ignored. The guard remained still, calm, and focused, a silent reminder that tradition and duty were not things to be taken lightly. This was no longer just a casual visit for anyone present. It had become a moment that would soon teach a lesson, whether the tourists were ready for it or not. The guard did not react immediately. From the outside, he looked calm and unmoving, just like the many guards tourists had seen in pictures and videos. But inside, he was fully aware of what was happening. His training had taught him to stay patient, to observe first, and to give people a chance to correct their behavior on their own. Many visitors crossed lines without meaning harm. Sometimes, a simple warning was enough. The two tourists, however, showed no sign of stopping. One of them leaned forward slightly, waving his hand near the boundary as if testing how close he could get. The other laughed and raised his phone higher, clearly enjoying the attention they were drawing. They spoke loudly, their voices cutting through the quiet respect that most of the crowd had been maintaining. Every laugh echoed more than it should have. The guard straightened his posture just a little, a small movement that most people would not notice. But those who had seen guards before knew it meant awareness. His eyes shifted, sharp and focused now, directly toward the tourists. The horse beneath him lifted its head, sensing the change in its rider. Years of working together had created a silent understanding between them. In a clear, firm voice, the guard gave a warning. His words were simple and loud enough for everyone to hear. He instructed the tourists to step back and respect the boundary. There was no anger in his tone, only authority. The crowd went quiet. Even the sound of camera clicks slowed as people waited to see what would happen next. For a brief moment, the tourists froze. They looked at each other, surprised that the guard had finally spoken. One of them shrugged, as if to say it was no big deal. The other smiled awkwardly, clearly unsure how to respond. Instead of stepping back immediately, they hesitated, whispering something to each other. The guard repeated the warning, just as clearly as before. This time, his voice carried more weight. It was no longer a polite reminder. It was a direct instruction. The horse took a small step forward, not aggressively, but enough to show readiness. The space between duty and action was getting smaller. Some people in the crowd nodded in approval. Others felt nervous and stepped farther back, pulling friends and family with them. Parents covered their children's ears, not because of noise, but because they sensed tension. A few tourists quietly hoped the two men would simply move away and let the moment pass. But the tourists misunderstood the situation. They believed the warning was part of the routine, something meant to impress the crowd. One of them laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. He raised his hands jokingly, as if pretending to surrender, but he did not move back. The other tourist stepped sideways, still inside the restricted area, trying to get a better angle for his photo. The guard felt a deep sense of disappointment. Moments like these were difficult. He did not enjoy confrontation. His role was often misunderstood as harsh or cold, but it required great control. Every action he took would be watched, recorded, and judged by people who did not understand the rules he lived by. Still, his responsibility was clear. He raised his voice one final time, firm and unmistakable. This was the last warning. His words cut through the air, leaving no room for confusion. The horse shifted its weight again, muscles tense but controlled. The guard tightened the reins slightly, signaling readiness without panic. The tourists finally seemed to realize that this was not a game. Their smiles faded. One of them took a half step back, but the other remained frozen, unsure of what to do. Fear slowly replaced excitement in their expressions. The crowd watched in silence, the earlier laughter completely gone. Security staff nearby had noticed the situation as well. They moved closer, ready to assist if needed. Their presence added to the seriousness of the moment. This was no longer just between a guard and two tourists. It had become a public lesson in respect and awareness. The guard waited a few more seconds, giving the tourists a final chance to move away on their own. Time felt stretched. Every small movement felt important. The air was heavy with expectation. The horse breathed steadily, calm but alert, trusting its rider completely. One tourist finally pulled his friend's arm, urging him to step back. They both moved slightly, but not far enough. The boundary was still crossed. The rules were still being ignored. The guard knew that hesitation now could weaken authority and invite more disrespect in the future. This moment was not about pride or punishment. It was about setting a clear example. The guard prepared himself to act, knowing that whatever happened next would be remembered by everyone present. Cameras were still raised, but now they captured seriousness, not humor. The peaceful morning had fully changed. What began as simple curiosity had turned into a test of discipline and understanding. The guard remained steady, his focus unbroken, ready to do what his duty required, even if it meant being misunderstood by those who had chosen not to listen. The guard made his decision in a calm and controlled way. There was no anger on his face, no rush in his movements. Everything he did came from training, experience, and responsibility. He gently pressed his heels and guided the horse forward, not to harm anyone, but to protect the boundary that had been ignored for too long. The movement was firm and sudden enough to be taken seriously, yet careful and measured. The horse responded immediately. It moved forward with strength and confidence, its steps clear and powerful against the stone ground. The sound alone was enough to change the mood. The tourists' laughter stopped completely. Their faces turned pale as they realized this was not a show or a joke. The horse did not rush wildly. It moved with purpose, stopping just close enough to make the message clear. The two tourists stumbled backward in surprise. One nearly lost his balance as he tried to step away quickly. The other raised his hands without thinking, his phone slipping slightly in his grip. Fear replaced excitement in a matter of seconds. They had expected words, maybe embarrassment, but not action. Now they understood that they had crossed a serious line. The crowd reacted all at once. Some people gasped softly. Others stepped back quickly, creating more space around the scene. Cameras were still recording, but hands trembled slightly now. This was no longer entertainment. It was a real moment unfolding in front of them, one that demanded attention and respect. The guard brought the horse to a controlled stop. He did not chase the tourists or move beyond what was necessary. His posture remained straight, his expression calm. His voice rang out clearly, instructing the tourists to move away immediately and respect the rules. There was no shouting, only authority. The message was complete and final. The tourists did not argue this time. They nodded quickly, apologizing in broken words, though their voices shook. They stepped back fully beyond the boundary, their earlier confidence completely gone. One of them avoided eye contact, staring at the ground. The other looked around, realizing how many people had witnessed their mistake. The horse stood steady, unbothered by the sudden movement around it. Years of training had prepared it for moments like this. The guard gently loosened the reins, signaling that the situation was under control. The tension in the air slowly began to ease, though the silence remained heavy. Security staff approached and positioned themselves near the tourists. Their presence was calm but firm. They spoke quietly to the two men, guiding them away from the area without creating more attention. The tourists followed without resistance, their steps slow and embarrassed. No one laughed now. The lesson had been delivered clearly enough. As the tourists were escorted away, the guard turned his focus forward again. He guided the horse back to its original position with smooth movements. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed like nothing unusual had happened. But everyone there knew they had witnessed something important. The guard stood tall, as he had before, but inside he felt the weight of the moment. Acting was never easy. He knew that videos of the event might spread, and people who were not there would form opinions without understanding the full story. Still, he believed he had done the right thing. His duty was not to please everyone. It was to protect, to maintain order, and to represent tradition with discipline. The crowd slowly returned to normal. Whispers replaced silence. Some people nodded quietly in approval. Others looked thoughtful, perhaps questioning their own behavior as visitors. Parents spoke softly to their children, explaining the importance of rules and respect. The atmosphere, though calmer, felt more serious than before. The horse shifted slightly beneath the guard, its breathing steady and calm. The bond between them was built on trust. In moments of tension, they worked as one. The guard gave the horse a gentle pat, barely noticeable but meaningful. It was a silent thank you. Time passed and the sounds of the landmark returned, soft footsteps, low voices, camera clicks, but the energy had changed. People stood a little farther back now. They paid more attention to signs and boundaries. The guard's action had done more than stop two tourists. It had reminded everyone present that this place carried meaning beyond photos and fun. The guard remained still, his eyes forward, his posture unchanged. Yet inside, he reflected briefly. He hoped the tourists would remember this moment not with anger but with understanding. He hoped they would tell others not just about fear, but about respect. Real lessons often come from uncomfortable moments, and this was one of them. As the sun continued to rise higher in the sky, the morning moved on. But for many who were there, this moment would stay with them long after they left. It was a reminder that real life is not always soft or forgiving, but it is fair when rules are clear and duties are honored. The guard stayed at his post, calm and steady, a quiet symbol of discipline in a world that often forgets the value of boundaries. After the tourists were taken away, the area slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the mood was not exactly the same. People still stood around, yet their voices were softer and their movements more careful. The moment had left a strong impression on everyone who witnessed it. What had happened was not loud or dramatic, but it was powerful in a quiet way. It reminded people that real-life places carry real responsibilities. The guard remained at his post, just as trained. His face showed no emotion, but inside he felt a mix of thoughts. He knew some people would support his action, while others might question it. That was always the case with public duty. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside. His focus returned to the present, to the safety of the area, and to the role he had sworn to uphold. Nearby, small groups of tourists began discussing what they had seen. Some spoke with respect, saying the guard acted fairly and professionally. They understood that rules exist for a reason and that warnings should never be ignored. Others seemed unsure, wondering if the situation could have ended differently. These conversations stayed calm and thoughtful, showing that the moment had encouraged reflection rather than anger. Parents used the situation as a teaching moment for their children. They explained why it was important to respect local customs and follow instructions, especially in places tied to history and tradition. Children listened closely, their eyes still wide from the earlier tension. For them, the event became a real-life lesson that no book could explain so clearly. The guard noticed how people now kept a safe distance from the boundary. Signs that had been ignored before were suddenly being read carefully. Visitors adjusted their positions without being asked. This silent change showed that the message had been understood. Sometimes, one clear action could do more than many spoken warnings. Security staff returned to their regular positions, satisfied that the situation had been handled correctly. They exchanged brief glances with the guard, not needing words. In their line of work, trust and understanding were built through shared experience. They all knew how quickly small moments could turn serious if not handled properly. Elsewhere, the two tourists sat quietly on a bench, away from the crowd. The excitement they had felt earlier was gone. One stared at his phone, replaying the moment in his mind. The other rubbed his hands together, clearly embarrassed. They spoke softly, realizing how close their behavior had come to causing a much bigger problem. What they thought was harmless fun had turned into a moment they would never forget. As time passed, the story of the incident spread quietly through the crowd. New visitors arrived, unaware of what had happened earlier. Those who had witnessed it spoke in low voices, careful not to exaggerate. The story was not told as a joke, but as a reminder. It carried a tone of seriousness and respect. The guard continued standing tall, his presence steady and reassuring. Though the moment had passed, its effect remained. His role was not just to protect a space, but to represent discipline, patience, and responsibility. These values were not always visible, but they were always present in his actions. Inside, the guard reflected briefly on the changing world around him. More people traveled now, more cultures mixed, and misunderstandings happened easily. He understood that not everyone knew the rules or traditions. That was why warnings came first. But he also knew that respect could not be optional. It had to be shown, especially in places where history lived in stone and silence. The horse beneath him shifted gently, relaxed once more. The earlier tension had faded completely. The guard adjusted his posture slightly, maintaining comfort without losing discipline. The connection between them was built on trust and routine, a partnership shaped by countless hours of training. The crowd slowly returned to enjoying their visit. Cameras clicked again, though with more care. Smiles returned, but they were quieter now. The atmosphere felt more balanced, as if everyone had been reminded of the importance of awareness. The landmark stood unchanged, yet the people within it had been subtly transformed by what they witnessed. As the sun moved higher, light reflected off the stone walls, warming the air. The guard stood still, blending into the history around him. He knew that by the end of the day, many people would forget the details of the event. But the feeling it created, the sense of respect and understanding, would remain longer than the memory itself. This part of the story was not about action, but about reflection. It showed how one moment could ripple through many lives, changing attitudes without force. The guard did not seek praise or attention. His duty was done, and that was enough. In silence, he continued his watch, knowing that real strength often appeared not in loud moments, but in calm ones that taught others how to behave with respect. The hours that followed felt slower, as if time itself had decided to move carefully after what had happened. The landmark remained open, visitors continued to arrive, and life went on, but the earlier moment stayed in the air like a quiet reminder. People walked with more awareness now. They looked at the guards not as part of a display, but as real people carrying real responsibility. The guard stayed focused on his duty, even as his shift continued. Standing still for long periods was never easy, yet discipline had taught him how to control his body and mind. He kept his breathing steady and his thoughts clear. What had happened earlier did not distract him anymore. Once a moment passed, it was important to let it go. Holding onto it could weaken focus, and focus was everything in his role. Around him, tourists behaved differently than before. Some nodded politely as they passed. Others whispered words of appreciation, though the guard did not react. He was trained not to respond to praise or criticism. Still, these small gestures showed that people had understood something important. Respect did not need applause. It showed itself through behavior. A few visitors quietly discussed similar experiences they had seen in other places. They spoke about how different cultures had different rules, and how travel was not just about taking pictures, but about learning. These conversations were thoughtful and calm. The earlier tension had turned into understanding, and that change mattered more than any single action. Not far away, a guide gently explained the rules to a new group of tourists. He pointed out the boundaries and spoke about the importance of tradition. His voice was steady and respectful. The group listened closely, nodding as they followed his instructions. The guide did not mention the earlier incident directly, but the seriousness in his tone suggested that respect was not optional here. The guard noticed this and felt a quiet sense of relief. Prevention was always better than correction. If people understood the rules clearly, moments like earlier could be avoided. Education and awareness were just as important as authority. The two tourists who had caused the situation earlier were now completely out of sight, yet their experience continued to shape the day for others. Sometimes, lessons learned by one person helped many more without them even realizing it. That was the strange power of public moments. As the day moved forward, the guard's thoughts briefly turned inward. He remembered his training days, the long hours, the strict rules, and the lessons about patience and control. He had learned that strength was not about force, but about knowing when and how to act. Earlier, he had acted at the right moment, no sooner and no later. That balance was not easy, but it defined professionalism. The horse beneath him remained calm, shifting its weight now and then. It, too, was part of this silent lesson. Its controlled movement earlier had spoken louder than words. Animals trained with care responded with trust, and trust made every action safer. The guard gently adjusted the reins, keeping the connection steady. Visitors continued to come and go. Some stayed longer, observing quietly. Others took their photos and moved on. The landmark witnessed it all, just as it had for generations. It had seen moments of joy, curiosity, misunderstanding, and learning. Today was simply another chapter in its long story. As afternoon approached, the light changed, casting softer shadows across the ground. The earlier sharp tension felt distant now, like a memory fading into reflection. Yet its effect remained in the careful steps people took and the respectful silence they kept near the boundary. The guard remained steady until the end of his shift. When the time came for another guard to replace him, the transition happened smoothly and without attention. There was no discussion of the earlier event. In their world, duty continued without pause. As he finally stepped away, leading the horse calmly, the guard felt a quiet sense of completion. Not pride, not relief, just the knowledge that he had done his job as expected. That was enough. The day would end, tourists would return to their hotels, and stories would be shared. Some would speak about tradition, others about surprise, but all would carry a lesson with them. Respect was not demanded loudly. It was earned through understanding. And somewhere within that busy day, a simple moment had reminded many people that real life, unlike entertainment, required awareness, patience, and respect for rules that existed long before any visitor arrived. The day slowly moved toward its end, and with it came a feeling of quiet closure. The landmark stood just as it always had, strong and unchanged, while people continued to pass through its open space. Yet something invisible had shifted. Those who had been present earlier carried the memory with them, even if they did not speak about it openly. It was the kind of memory that settled gently in the mind and returned later, when reflection had time to grow. The two tourists were far away now, sitting in a small cafe on a nearby street. The noise of cups and low conversations surrounded them, but neither of them felt like talking much. What had happened earlier played again and again in their thoughts. At first, there was embarrassment. They realized how many eyes had been on them, how quickly a joke had turned serious. But as time passed, embarrassment slowly changed into understanding. One of them finally spoke, admitting that they had not taken the place seriously. He said they had treated it like a picture on a screen instead of a living space with rules and meaning. The other nodded, staring into his cup. He agreed that they had mistaken silence for permission and discipline for weakness. That realization stayed with them more deeply than fear ever could. They did not feel angry at the guard anymore. Instead, they felt thankful that the situation had ended without harm. They understood now that the guard's action was controlled, not careless. It was meant to protect, not to punish. That understanding brought a sense of calm they had not expected to feel. Back at the landmark, the flow of visitors continued until closing time. New faces arrived, unaware of what had happened earlier, while others quietly left, carrying lessons with them. Guides finished their explanations, security staff completed their rounds, and the space slowly grew quieter as the day ended. The guard, now off duty, walked calmly with the horse toward its resting place. The horse moved with relaxed steps, free from tension. The guard removed his gloves slowly, his movements unhurried. The day had been long but meaningful. He did not think of it as a special event. To him, it was simply another day where responsibility had mattered. As he cared for the horse, brushing it gently and making sure it was comfortable, his thoughts stayed peaceful. He believed deeply in routine. Routine kept the mind steady and prevented moments from becoming heavier than they needed to be. What mattered was that order had been maintained and that no one had been harmed. That evening, some visitors shared the story with friends and family. But the way they told it was different from how stories were often shared online. There was no exaggeration, no drama. Instead, there was reflection. People spoke about respect, about how travel required awareness, and about how rules existed for reasons beyond control. Some listeners nodded, others asked questions, and slowly the lesson spread further than the place itself. The tourists who had caused the situation decided to talk about it too, but honestly. They shared how quickly things could change when boundaries were ignored. They admitted their mistake openly, not as a joke, but as a learning moment. In doing so, they turned an uncomfortable experience into something meaningful. The landmark closed its gates as the sky darkened. Lights reflected softly on stone walls that had seen centuries of human behavior, curiosity, pride, misunderstanding, and growth. This day was just one more chapter in that long history, yet it mattered because of what it taught. The guard returned home later that night, tired but calm. He did not replay the moment again and again. He trusted his training and his judgment. For him, true strength was not in dramatic action but in controlled response. That belief guided him, just as it had guided many before him. In another part of the city, the tourists prepared for sleep, their thoughts quieter now. What had started as a careless moment had ended as a lesson they would carry into future travels. They knew now that respect was not about fear, but about understanding where you are and how to behave there. The story did not end with applause or punishment. It ended with awareness, with people walking away changed in small but important ways. With a reminder that real life does not pause for entertainment, and that places with history deserve more than laughter without thought. In the end, no one was harmed, no voices were raised, and no anger remained. Only a lesson stayed behind, clear, simple, and strong. Respect is not optional. It is a shared responsibility, carried quietly by those who understand its value. And so, the day ended not with noise, but with calm understanding, leaving behind a story that would be remembered not for fear, but for the moment it taught many people how to see the world with more care.